Welcome to David Duke Part David Do. First things first, if you haven't seen my initial video about former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi David Duke and his 1991 run for governor in Louisiana, please go watch that one first, since this video will be building off that one without having to rehash every single detail. I centered that video on the final runoff debate between David Duke and Edwin Edwards, in which journalist Norman Robinson bravely confronted Duke on his past and how the risk of someone like him getting elected would potentially affect the lives of those he deemed inferior and problematic. The reason I'm coming back to this topic is simple: the views. I'm not gonna lie. But also, after some time, I started to get the sense that my argument was being interpreted as one-dimensional. Like all I was saying was, here's a blatant racist and neo-Nazi that almost got elected to governor, and here are all the subsequent far-right conservatives, including our current president, that find themselves as spawns of the David Duke effect, and subsequently are exactly the same as David Duke. However, while I agree there's a more focused conversation to be had about racism and some conservative sects, that really wasn't the overall conclusion I was gunning for. I'm more curious about the environment created for someone so comically unqualified to potentially be the governor of an entire state, and how that environment was just the beginning of a wider American cultural movement. I chalk David Duke up to be nothing more than a professional political grifter, built on edgy fringe ideology that happened to be just present during the tides of a massive American shifting landscape. All to say, there's certainly more to this story than just the element of white Southerners casting a racist vote. As some of you recommended in the last video's comments, I read the book When the Clock Broke by Ganz. The book begins with David Duke's run for governor, but then it dives deeper into why the early 1990s became a nesting ground for American far-right cultural and political movements in general. It's also the main source for this video. So in this follow-up, I'd like to cover a few things. First, I'd like to touch on Duke's past a little bit more than what I previously did to set up the new information I'm going to present. Secondly, I want to focus on Louisiana's political history leading up to the 1980s that allowed an outsider like Duke to be a viable option. Thirdly, I want to look at America in the late 80s, early 90s, specifically regarding the aftershock of Reaganism. After that, I'll really dive into some deeper specifics about Duke's campaigns for state representative and governor, before concluding the video by looking at a more abstract question many seem pressed to answer: who is America? The pointer is back. This is going to be a long one, so grab a drink and a snack, and let's do this. But before we get into it, some quick redactions from the last video. As many of you pointed out, the Keep Forsyth White movement, where David Duke spoke in 1988, was in fact in Forsyth County, Georgia, and not the city of Forsyth, Georgia. Thank you to those who corrected me. Another one I'd like to partially redact is the use of Ross Perot and Ron Paul in a clip while mentioning far-right fanatics like Duke that came out of the woodwork following his run. I'm going to talk more about Perot in this video, but I want to quickly revise my last statements to say that I don't believe that Duke and Perot or Paul are one-to-one comparisons, but more on that later. David Duke is not a native Louisianian. He actually relocated to New Orleans as a child from Kansas in the 1950s after his father got a job with Shell. As a kid, David was already an outsider in many ways, not earning a lot of popularity with other kids at school who nicknamed him Puke Duke. When he was 14 years old, he got a hold of a newsletter from the Citizens Council of Greater New Orleans. This group was one branch of a larger organization spread across the South that opposed school integration and voter registration during the 1950s and 60s. This particular branch was founded by Leander Perez, a former principal lieutenant of Governor Huey Long. Known as the Caesar of the Swampland, Leander Perez was essentially a dictator in Plaquemines Parish and St. Bernard Parish for over 50 years, first as a judge, then DA, and finally president of Plaquemines Parish. And this answers the question of why St. Bernard is this weird outlier parish here that Duke won in the 91 governor's race. To hit on some highlights of Perez's resume, in 1960, he formed a mob that attacked blacks in the street with knives and clubs, and later built a concentration camp model to run off Freedom Riders who came to Plaquemines Parish to register voters. Duke first showed up at the citizen's office looking for a copy of the book Race and Reason, a book that promoted black biological inferiority and warned of the dangers of racial miscegenation. And to Duke's small shred of credit, this may not have been out of his own curiosity, as it was actually required reading by the Louisiana Department of Education for some high schools and colleges at the time. After some time, Duke became a regular around the office, even showing up with a copy of Mein Kampf while rambling on about his anti-Semitic opinions. Word is that some members of the council urged Duke to not go full Nazi, though this claim is arguable given Perez's willingness to be unashamedly and publicly anti-Semitic. In the last video, I mentioned Duke would go on to LSU, where he regularly made a scene in Free Speech Alley, arguing with other students while parading around in Nazi regalia. But his social status continued to suffer as he struggled to fit in there too. You see, the desire for popularity while simultaneously being a fringe overlord is the great dichotomy of David Duke. For instance, when he later became the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and attempted to reform it, he also couldn't resist the tendency to self-promote himself at any given chance and alienate his fellow clanmates in the process. It also didn't help that he reportedly hit on all of their wives with that Topher Grace face of his. Duke desired to find mainstream popularity, but simultaneously wanted to carve that path by way of his fringe beliefs, creating a sort of contradiction in the pursuit of mass appeal with narrow ideology. Only in the most aligned social, cultural, and economic conditions would the two needs have a chance to coexist. Public office was always Duke's aim, but he was spectacularly bad at winning. After departing the Klan, Duke spent the better part of the 1980s running for various offices. But by the time he ran for governor in 1991, he had already lost 7 of 8 attempted campaigns. But that didn't mean he wasn't gaining any meaningful traction. Like I mentioned in the last video, Duke's greatest strength, hands down, was his ability to create fear-based, reactionary, and emotional uproar, while remaining intellectually calm, to which I argue, where most callous arguments are quickly cast away, gave his words some ground to linger for sympathetic ears to latch onto. It was just a matter of holding out and staying relevant long enough until the right backdrop presented itself. And at the tail end of the 1980s, Louisiana became that very backdrop Duke was seeking. Fresh off a failed presidential run in 1988 that didn't come close to registering a pulse, Duke not only saw the deteriorating economic conditions back home, but more importantly, a need for the middle class to place blame somewhere. And so Duke's endless swings and misses would soon finally connect with a hit. Louisiana is a different creature compared to every other state in the Union. Its history is rich with authoritarian regimes. You had French and Spanish absolute monarchies, to the regime of plantation owners, to the post-Reconstruction Bourbon oligarchy that actually staged an 1877 coup that reigned until Huey Long came to office in 1928. Multiculturalism was also very much a part of Louisiana's legacy long before the concept existed in the modern sense. You once had the French South, the Anglo-North, Catholics, Protestants, whites, blacks, sugar planters, cotton farmers, immigrants, natives, elitists, and populists, all living under one roof. Tyranny flowed in and out with the occasional anarchy. The long-lasting era Huey Long established is no exception, often cited as America's first flirtation with an absolute socialist state ruled by an unbreakable dictator in Long. Long established his dominion by expanding the state government with a legion of patronage jobs, while putting in his own people where it mattered and removing his enemies where he saw necessary. Huey's campaign was spearheaded by the slogan, "Share Our Wealth," and was able to accomplish this by heavily taxing Standard Oil. And certainly didn't hurt when he took the liberty to create his own company that would sell and lease state land to Standard Oil, building up his personal wealth in the process. But regular corruption at the top like this could be tolerated as long as the money was finding its way down to the masses. The rural poor religiously admired Long, but both admirers and detractors couldn't help notice how close Louisiana was to a totalitarian state that the American Republic had ever seen. Following his assassination, Huey's era set the standard for Louisiana governors for many years to come. Democratic governors were shoo-ins that practiced big government while riding the wave of the oil booms to fund education and build infrastructure that kept voters happy. Governor Edwin Edwards even continued the tried and true methods of Huey Long that remained effective in his first 2 terms between 1972 and 1980. However, he built on this, becoming the first candidate since Reconstruction to actively campaign for the black vote. High oil revenue allowed Edwards the wiggle room to pursue his own excesses and corrupt behavior, though he eventually began to feel the pressure of business interests as time went on. But then the 1980s hit as Edwards departed office, and the bottom fell out of the oil industry in Louisiana. So here you have a state built on the unpredictability of political regimes coming in and out of power, rooted in a multicultural, complicated history, propped up for years on the reliability of oil cash flows, now faced with double-digit unemployment that led the nation. And so David Duke entered the race for the 81st Congressional District in Metairie in 1989. Ready to root out a reason for such rapid negative change in Louisiana, where answers or solutions alone no longer seem to be enough. But before we get into Duke's campaigns, let's now go broader and evaluate what was happening on a national level in America. Ronald Reagan's neoliberal economic policies in the 1980s were defined by a few key features: mass deregulation, tax cuts, high interest rates, and scaled back social services. In the immediacy of this, America exploded with wealth for a certain few, mainly from income sources like rents, dividends, capital gains, and interest, while organized labor was grounded and tight monetary policy meant to calm inflation ended up stagnating wages. So the wealth gap in America grew. The top 1% grew over 75% over the decade, while the middle class, defined by those who made between $18,000 and $55,000, shrunk by 20%. Debt also blew up on a corporate, consumer, and government level as the free market opened wider and people chaotically ran amok with borrowing at an unprecedented rate. But by the time Reagan was out of office and George H.W. Bush came in, the cascade of debt had caught up to corporations, while military spending left the nation with a $3 trillion additional debt. Corporations implemented survivalist strategies to combat the chaotic market conditions by cutting their workforces, closing their plants, or investing in labor-saving technology. The sense of victory the end of the Cold War was supposed to bring didn't ring loudly on the domestic front. In addition to the debt explosion fallout, television sensationalism grew while social thinkers declared about American culture. Individualism had grown cancerous. But beyond economic woes, America started to splinter socially and culturally too. The end of the Cold War meant for the first time since World War II, America no longer had a common enemy to stand as a unified front against. And some might argue it was only natural that the country would turn its sights on each other. In '88, Bush entered office determined to not rock the boat in any sort of way. The globalist state Reaganism left America in was exactly what Bush aimed to preserve. When Bush jumped into the Persian Gulf War in 1990, he began preaching a greater responsibility that America had as a player on the global scale. He spoke of a new world order, where the US and other world leaders would act together to keep the peace, a phrase many American conservatives saw as sinisterly pushing for a new totalitarian and globalist movement. In 1991, televangelist Pat Robertson dropped his book titled The New World Order. In it, he promoted conspiracy thinking surrounding the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Rothschilds, the New Age movement, and a trilateral commission in a plot for complete world monetary control. When the Persian Gulf War failed to hold back a recession, mistrust and suspicion of the American government and their so-called global responsibility kicked in even more. Already sour on the two-party system, the general disposition by many was that the political system was ruled by lobbyists, PACs, and sensationalist media. American outrage led many to seek out political blood to put their displeasure on display. You saw this in 1990 in California, Oklahoma, and Colorado, with ballot initiatives to limit terms of state legislators. But the options for blame went beyond political groups. The largest wave of immigration since the dawn of the 20th century was also taking place, creating a bleak outlook on multiculturalism out of fear that America would become balkanized, which hurt its chances to unify against the influential elites and major economic organizations that were leaving the rest of the country behind. Furthermore, the left and the right grew further apart with the rise of political correctness and its overall perceived objectives. Some argued political correctness as a defense for multiculturalism, while others saw it as a new form of McCarthyism. The middle class might have been mad, but more so disillusioned, both on the right and the left. There are a couple of excerpts the book mentions giving perspective on the times. The first is from the neoconservative Francis Fukuyama's 1989 essay, The End of History. Fukuyama defines this as a period of continued ethnic conflict as well as cultural fatigue and depletion. The worldwide ideological struggle that called forth courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and satisfaction of consumer demands. There will be neither art or philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. Cultural critic and historian Christopher Lasch builds on this and offers a solution. Liberalism is crumbling. Having defeated its totalitarian adversaries, now a sort of nihilism has set in. The Earth's ecology is failing due to the pursuits of the past century plus, and progress and optimism should be abandoned in favor of a more frugal model. In a world of growing, spoiled consumers and bureaucrats, Lasch advocates for inspiration found within lower middle class ethos of American populist tradition. Its emphasis on community-centered and the heroic morality of small producers, like artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. Egalitarianism in favor of entrenched privilege, refusal to be impressed by the jargon of experts, insistence on plain speech, and holding people accountable for their actions. There was a sense to get back to basics to recapture something long forgotten, and depending on who you ask, what made America what it was in the first place. Lasch's vision is admirable. It's a respectable take on populism that's capable of creating positive enthusiasm. But there's also plenty of potential to compromise the hopefulness of this vision by pushing it to the extremes of getting back to basics. That included very old American basics like racism, anti-Semitism, nativism, and anti-intellectualism. To do this meant embracing a negative solidarity by opposing domestic enemies in the great search for making America great again. You see what I did there? So which way would many Louisiana white middle-class people ride this wave of discontent in search for greater American tradition that could ease their spirits in the wake of economic downturn? Optimistic egalitarianism, or cynicism hinged on any argument beginning with the phrase, "Back in my day"? Well, just take a look at the GOP's deployment of the Southern strategy during the 1980s, used by both Reagan and Bush to win over Southern whites, where they used regular phrases like welfare queens, state rights, black criminality, and you can probably guess the answer. So after all of that, you have the true precursor event for David Duke running for state representative, state senator, and then governor, all between 1989 and 1991. And given Louisiana's historical nature to flirt with political upheaval and chaos, those perfect conditions I mentioned earlier about Duke finding mass appeal with his narrow ideology were starting to come together. Let's look at Jefferson Parish and Metairie, where Duke first found success, winning the election for the 81st District State Representative in 1989. At the time, the parish was 99.6 white, made up of those who fled neighboring multiracial New Orleans, citing black crime as the main reason for their white flight. During the 1980s, the 81st District alone had worse stagnant middle-income wages compared to the rest of the country. The parish lost 45% of its oil and gas jobs, 30% of its construction jobs, and 17% of its manufacturing jobs. All the while, the country club elites in the parish that made a killing off Reagan's policies prospered. John Treen, who David Duke defeated in this election, was a member of this country club elite. John was the brother of former Governor David Treen, who was quickly unseated after one lackluster term by Edwin Edwards in his great return in 1983. You guys seem to love a good Edwin Edwards quote, so here's another one regarding that election. "The only way I can lose this election is if I'm caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy." Dave Treen was the first Republican governor the state had seen since Reconstruction, but it's clear the 1980s status quo Republican conservative wasn't quite up to Louisiana's lively political appetite. Buddy Roemer found a compromise in 1987. A conservative Democrat and champion for good government and reform, he initially stood his own as the first and only person to beat Edwin Edwards in a governor's race in 1987. He was a middle ground worth taking a chance on for a state itching for change from the corruptive ways of Edwards, but not too far in the direction of elitists and business interests. However, Romer defaulted often to the business interests of the state and not the middle class. He kept social spending flat, cut unemployment benefits, raised university tuition, and limited workers' ability to sue their employers. Then, most controversially, he proposed to cut the homestead exemption, which exempted houses valued under $75,000 from property taxes. Back in Jefferson Parish, by way of a collection of powerful tax assessors, the middle class essentially never paid any property taxes. Duke quickly jumped to defend this exemption while keeping his platform in line with the Southern strategy, placing further blame on welfare dependence, affirmative action, and minority quotas. He spun a solution with a sort of eugenics take, calling to reduce the illegitimate welfare birth rate that becomes the source of crime and social ills. And we all know what he meant by that. But while the homestead exemption is a decent practical fight, it's amazing how a desire for cultural change suddenly becomes the driving selling point once that key economical factor opens the door for such discontent. And so blame is often the therapeutic release to a completely unrelated matter altogether. And even deeper, it's used as a method to reclaim some sort of identity. After winning the 81st, Duke took a shot at the Senate against J. Bennett Johnson in 1990, ultimately losing but winning 59% of the white vote. Using this momentum, he moved his sights to governor. Duke declared he was like Huey Long in reverse. Instead of share our wealth, he preached hoard our wealth, and continued to harp on no more welfare abuse, no more affirmative action, no more social programs, creating more prisons, ending busing, and the death penalty for drug dealers. I remind you of those jobs lost in his Metairie district and how irrelevant those matters had become despite being the thing that upset the middle class to begin with. I mentioned in the last video how GOP member Beth Rickey worked tirelessly to amass past information on Duke and use it against him to prevent him from getting elected governor. She began to suspect there was more agreement on the race issue than before, but evolved beyond the sort of racism the Klan practiced. It was now expertly interwoven with economic failures and hardships of the state. David Duke managed to formulate a message new to American politics called respectable racism, which argued race as a biological and social reality as opposed to the denial of race that both conservatives and liberals endorsed. By this point, Buddy Romer had gone full establishment man. He switched parties after being recruited by George H.W. Bush while leaving the state GOP out of the loop, further alienating himself on his own home front. The Louisiana GOP even went on to nominate Clyde Holloway as their candidate in 1991, even though Romer was technically the GOP incumbent. But Duke demanded to speak at the state GOP convention, with the crowd chanting for him as well. While Romer had sold out to the elites, Duke seemed to fill the void for white middle-class conservative voices. But Duke's growing strength can't be characterized by any real political success. He never passed a bill as a state representative. The only thing he achieved was when he proposed a bill to offer welfare mothers $100 to have a birth control device implanted in their arms. But this quickly got watered down to just offering information about birth control, which was already in state policy. It was anger feeding that made him popular. When visiting a Kiwanis Club or VFW hall, it was obvious who he meant when talking about welfare mothers. He was actually quoted saying, "The greatest problem facing this state is the rising welfare underclass." Someone gracefully yelled back, "The N-words." One single unemployed white woman on welfare had the gall to say that black women have babies to go on welfare. When questioned about her own drain on the welfare system, she rebutted, "Yeah, but the blacks get more." Buddy Romer's staff created a focus group of white blue-collar swing voters in Jefferson Parish and painted the picture of a potential candidate for them. This was a guy who dodged the draft, avoided paying taxes, had plastic surgery, and never held a job. The focus group responded with disgust, but when asked the same question while naming Duke as the candidate, the group defended him. One woman was quoted saying, "Only dumb people pay taxes. Politicians and millionaires don't because they're smart. Duke must be smart." When Edwards and Duke debated in front of the state convention of the Louisiana AARP, Edwards promised improvements for seniors. The crowd was disinterested though until Duke started talking about the illegitimate birth rate and welfare underclass. Edwards responded by saying a mother only gets $11 a week extra for every additional child. Would a woman really go that far for an extra $11? Apparently the crowd roared back at him, "Yeah." Edwards was booed out and the AARP endorsed Duke. While Duke's past was divisive, people were growing more comfortable with it. One person was quoted saying, "We know about Duke's past. We know about Louisiana's future. We know he doesn't care for blacks. We know he won't get along with the legislature. And just maybe, we like it." As the country began to grip with the anxiety of multiculturalism and of factoring into competing interest groups, this had long been the case in Louisiana, and the chaos bred David Duke almost to the top. I discussed in the last video how Duke grabbed 56% of the white vote in the '91 race, but would still end up losing to Edwards, especially after business interests and even Romer got behind the latter, along with a 78% black turnout for the vote. Edwards said the following post-victory: "Prophecy is reserved for those who are given that special gift, which I do not possess. But I say to all of America tonight, there will be other places and other times where there will be other challenges by other David Dukes. They too will be peddling bigotry and division as their elixir of false hope. They too will be riding piggyback on the frustration of citizens disaffected by the government. Tonight, Louisiana defeated the darkness of hate, bigotry, and division. But where will the next challenge come from? Will it be in another campaign in Louisiana, or in a campaign for governor in some other state, or in a campaign for president of the United States?" A victory against Duke didn't mean discontent evaporated. In fact, it was spreading across America. Duke had proven you could create havoc with a call to arms in search for who America should be. The book says this about Duke. Duke aimed to solve the issues of his own status by hyper-focusing on the image of permanent hierarchies, which provided a more concrete and permanent station in life than the vagaries of class mobility and aspiration, which are always vulnerable to the winds of fortune and failure. As Bruce Springsteen said in one of my favorite songs of all time, Atlantic City, "Down here is just winners and losers, and don't get caught on the wrong side of that line." But many Americans saw themselves on the wrong side with no way out, no longer believing the system allowed that mobility to take place any longer. And permanent hierarchies didn't seem like a bad option for some to revert to. Because why risk being on either side when you can simply supplant yourself in a class incapable of slipping below another? The book goes on. In the face of unfriendly and alienated social reality, there was always an imaginary world of power and prestige to conjure up, where the existence of a secret Jewish conspiracy explained Duke's lack of status. Just replace secret Jewish conspiracy with welfare state and his lack of status with the economic woes of the white middle class, and you have an interchangeable argument that a political demagoguery can birth itself out of. Duke went on to say, "If the ideals that I stand for are addressed, then I will only be a footnote in history. But if the deterioration of the white middle class continues, then I will be president." David Duke's defeat in the '91 Louisiana governor's race was the end of his 15 minutes in the spotlight for the most part, up until Charlottesville 2017. But the wave he proved could be ridden led him to run for president in 1992, before his momentum was stolen initially by paleo-conservative Pat Buchanan, who would then be overtaken by independent Ross Perot in the same campaign. Pat Buchanan recognized the appeal of Duke's platform, middle class, meritocratic, populist, and nationalist, to put America first and hand down Western heritage to future generations and not dump it into a forgettable heaping pile of multiculturalism. Buchanan was altogether a more disciplined candidate to run on Duke's campaign. The paleo sect of the right sought to return to the early 1920s at the latest, or even pre-Civil War. Furthermore, they're defined as humanists who reject managerial technocracy that praises white civilizational virtue while remaining cynical about democracy itself. Buchanan came out swinging hard at first, but Texan billionaire Ross Perot snatched his alternative candidate thunder when Buchanan proved a little too cynical and cold for the country. However, Perot was too paranoid of a candidate and too rigid to delegate to his campaign managers, which led him to dropping out and then re-entering again a couple months before the election. Still, he ended up taking 19% of the popular vote. Now, Ross Perot was not Pat Buchanan, while Pat was a whole lot like David Duke in many ways. But what you can't deny is they all represented one of the grandest showcases for the alternative candidate in American political history that ended up with the status quo H.W. Bush being beaten by Bill Clinton. Which leads me to talk about a chapter from another book, The 90s by Chuck Klosterman. He has a whole chapter dedicated to the '92 election before ending it with an interesting comparison: Ross Perot and Donald Trump. Feel you typing already. The surface comparisons between Trump and Perot are pretty obvious. Both were billionaires, both were against free trade and immigration, and both were willing to push conspiracies and bite at the media when pushed up against the wall. Both used unorthodox platforms to launch their campaigns, and their colorful language made them particularly appealing and non-politician in character. Now, Perot's desire to balance the budget, decrease the debt, and support pro-choice and allegedly gay rights would ultimately align with the New Democrats and the goals of the Clinton administration, where Trump would pretty much go the opposite way. But the big similarity that people really want to draw is that of the unconventional candidate. The first reaction by any unconventional candidate by institutions is to marginalize them as crazy or unreasonable. If that fails to register, then their voter base is attacked. And if they win, like in Trump's case, then many opponents will paint them further as an anti-intellectual and deranged cultic caricature that's willing to blow up the entire system in the name of their new political Jesus. But Chuck makes a good point. What I just described wasn't Perot voters, even though Perot was seen as pretty kooky. For instance, Perot voters were certainly not anti-intellectual, and most importantly, Perot, unlike Trump who actually did proclaim he wanted to blow up the system, felt more like the system would explode if he didn't get involved and save it. In the last video, I threw third-party and alternative candidates, including Perot and Ron Paul, haphazardly into one bucket and made it appear that Duke alone created that chain reaction. But while a lot of fringe candidates came to prominence around the same time as Duke, I should mention here that even Bernie Sanders won his first congressional race as a Democratic Socialist in 1990, a rapidly changing America on all cultural, social, and economic levels was the real driver behind it all. I know, big duh. And so I don't really discredit people for seeking out other choices during times of hardships when many were constantly receiving the short end of the stick. That change and disruption is definitely not an easy thing to navigate as a nation, but that doesn't mean I endorse tapping out, not trying to navigate it, or dialing things back to more primitive times, like the paleocons aspire to. I admire Perot's determination to save, adjust, and improve it, instead of Donald Trump's proclamation to constantly destroy it. And when I discuss David Duke and compare his policies to Trump, it's in this way. Duke didn't seek to save the system in Louisiana. Instead, he thought he could shove one group of people and problems to one side while propping up the other and calling it a day in the name of a certain set of values, being the only right way to do things. Many Americans believed and still believe the current state of liberalism they were being served was no longer satisfactory, leaving people to consider which direction was the right way to go. Either with someone like Perot, who was a new breed of old-time values mixed with future-forward ingenuity, or dialing back the clock with a Pat Buchanan or David Duke to a time where white interests were always the main priority. Seeking what makes America America is often a contradiction between being the land of the free and opportunity for all, and that of a nation created with Judeo-Christian Western values principally in mind. It doesn't help when Americans tend to place individualism above community, which only makes any collective identity harder to paint. Yet that doesn't stop people from trying to lump America into what they believe is the correct grouping. David Duke assured many white middle-class Louisianians they were the correct grouping during a time when they felt overlooked and forgotten, and blame was the only thing they could give shape to and control during a time of economic and cultural whiplash. The same soon applied to the rest of America, and imitators across many political spectrums had newfound ground to stand on, firmly based on this American disillusionment. And with an argument that says everything America stands for will be absolutely destroyed if the domestic them wins, the door will forever be open to addictive and emotional partisan politics to come into play. When the Clock Broke explores other characters that rose out of this period, like New York's romanticization of mobster John Gotti, talk radio star Rush Limbaugh, the Rodney King riots and the Thin Blue Line, and the incidents surrounding the siege at Ruby Ridge. Factions were growing everywhere, and opportunists naturally rose up to provide their own brand of particular American commentary, carefully stroking their brush in a way to declare and assure their followers, hey, this is the real America, not that America, here's your America. But despite the sects people like David Duke enjoy carving out to achieve some long-awaited class ascension, no one political figure alone can dictate what American culture truly is or should be. It'll always lie somewhere in the boring ass middle with no discernible label to slap on it. Some might call that a multicultural, virtueless nightmare, but I just call it an imperfect compromise indicative of American democracy.